Hey, it's Brett. This is Brett and some books. We are going to try a different angle so that I can have both my hands and my knees. Really makes it more comfortable for me. And today we are continuing the mysteries of history, unraveling the truth from the myths of the past. Pope Joan, a woman on the fisherman's throne. This is by Graeme Donald. To endearing Vatican chagrin, belief in the existence of a ninth-century female pope, Joan, refuses to die, with books and films focusing on the early account uh, on her alleged reign still being turned out. Although early accounts vary, the standard version of the story alleges that after the death of Pope Leo IV, 17th of July, 855, a woman masquerading as the Englishman John Anglicus hoodwinked the Vatican cardinals into electing her to the papal throne, from which she reigned for some 2.5 years before her true gender was discovered in a very public and dramatic manner. Although an inspection of the chronology swiftly demolishes most, if not all, of her alleged history, we are still left with the mystery surrounding who started the tale in the first place and to what end. First mention of the scandal is noted in the 11th century writings of Marianus Scotus of the Abbey of St. Martin, Cologne, which assert, and note the author's mistaken date, in 854, Joanna, a woman, succeeded Pope Leo IV and reigned for 2 years, 5 months, and 4 days. Next to throw his hat into the ring was the 12th century scribe Sigebert de Gembloux, who alleged it is reported that this John was a female and that she conceived a child by one of her servants. But the most famous and detailed of all such early mentions is found in the Chronicle of the Popes and Emperors by Martin of Poland, date of death 1278, a bishop chronicler who maintained, after Leo, John Anglicus, a native of Mainz, a city in Germany's Rhineland, although others have her a native of Metz in northeastern France, reigned 2 years, 5 months, and 4 days. It is claimed that this John was a woman who, when a girl, had been brought to Athens in the clothes of a man by a certain lover. Once in that city, according to Martin, she excelled in science and philosophy until she had no equal. She next moved to Rome, where she maintained her deception to teach many of the great minds of the day, with her reputation for virtue and knowledge growing to such pitch that she was a natural choice for Pope. Martin further states, while Pope she became pregnant, and through ignorance of the exact time of the birth, she was delivered of a child while in procession from St. Peter's to the Lateran, in a narrow lane between the Colosseum and St. Clement's Church in the street. At this point, most accounts agree that both mother and child were beaten to death by the indignant mob. The Lord Pope always turns aside from this street in procession, and it is believed by many that this is done for abhorrence of the event. It is important to bear in mind that the medieval scribes and chroniclers were the photocopiers of their day, diligently replicating each other's work while inserting additions to cater to the prejudices of whoever was paying for the finished product. Once a genuine error or a malicious spoof got into the mix, it was destined for centuries of meticulous repetition. It was also common for those with a particular axe to grind in later centuries to bolster their fraud by the insertion of supportive additions into much earlier works. And it is significant that, in some hand-described copies of Martin's book, the lover who took Joan to Athens is referred to as her sweetheart, a term not known before 1290, and reference to her being pregnant presents her as being in the family way, an expression not known prior to the mid-17th century. Then there is the chronology of the papal line itself. The longest gap between any two popes did indeed occur in 855, the year of Joan's alleged ascension, after Leo IV died to leave in his wake a most undignified squabble over the succession. The first choice was Hadrian, Cardinal of St. Marco, but he had the good sense to turn the job down flat. Second choice was Benedict, whose rule was immediately interrupted by a group of militant bishops who carted him off to prison to make way for their choice of Anastasius, a machinating backstabber who had been anathematized and exiled by Leo IV. But when he and his supporters realized their coup was stillborn, Benedict was hurriedly released, dusted down, and reinstated as if nothing had happened. This game of musical thrones ran from 17 July 855 until 29 September the same year to give us Leo IV, followed by Benedict III and Nicholas I, all of which leaves us with no room for a papal reign spanning any 2 years of the decade, commencing in 850. Nor is there a single contemporary historical reference to any pope, Joan, or John in that decade, or to the violent nature of her death in the streets at the hands of a mob. Despite this mountain of evidence to the contrary, those who still cling to their belief in a female pope love to point out that papal processions, which once went down the narrow street mentioned by Martin of Poland, have avoided it for centuries. Pro-Joanists love to point out that this street, one of a tiny enclave of similar streets between the Colosseum and St. Clement's Church, is called Vicus Papessa, but this should not be translated as the street of the female pope. The street was not called that until the 10th century, when it was renamed in honor of the wife of Giovanni Pape, a rich merchant who lived there, so the name properly translates as the altogether less intriguing Mrs. Pape Street. Short of traipsing round in circles all day, papal processions would honor certain streets adjacent to their route with inclusion, providing the residents decked out the thoroughfare in a suitable manner and put a healthy sum into the Vatican coffers for the privilege. Apparently, Mrs. Pape loved the pomp and ceremony of papal processions, so Mr. Pape indulged her, but when the Pape family died out, the Vatican no longer had any incentive to venture down the steep and narrow street. There is also the matter of an admittedly puzzling throne-like marble chair held in the Vatican Museum. Once one of a pair, Napoleon is thought to have looted the other. This has a large keyhole shape cut out of the seat. This has been eagerly seized upon by pro-Joanists, who maintained that both chairs were made in the post-Joan era to ensure that no woman could ever again perpetrate such a fraud. According to that lobby, once the papal candidate had been selected, he was required to sit on one such chair with his genitalia visible to the voters, assembled in a special viewing chamber on the floor below. Next, the cleric selected to remain in the upper chamber with the candidate was required to reach under the chair and, taking hold of papal appendage, pronounce testiculos habet et bene penitentes, or he has testicles and they hang well. This is no doubt affording great comfort to all concerned. Needless to say, no such ceremony has ever been enacted. Some say these chairs were simply commodes, but the fact that the uprights are raked back at 45 degrees makes this unlikely. Others maintain that they were birthing chairs. Either way, they long predate the alleged time of Pope Joan, and indeed the advent of the Vatican itself. Which brings us back to the core question: who started this silly story and why did they do it? At the beginning of the 16th century, there was growing dissatisfaction across Europe over the way the Vatican conducted itself, especially when it came to the selling of indulgences. These were dispensations for sins available only to the rich, who could thus skip their allotted time of penance in purgatory and go straight to heaven. When indulgences were made available to cover up sins not yet committed, "I'll have 2 murders and 1 rape to go, please." It was a coffer-filling scam ran by the Vatican, which, more than anything else, led to the foundation of the Protestant Reform movement and, soon after, the Protestant Church itself. Determined to make its mark, this new movement did everything it could to blacken the name of the opposition in Rome. Its adherents' first successful propaganda coup was the spreading of gruesome tales about the activities of the Spanish Inquisition, which was nowhere near as draconian or punitive as the Protestant machine painted it. And then they came up with the idea of promoting the ultimate anathema to the Vatican, a female pope. Historian Edward Gibbon, author of The History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, 1776, argued that the inspiration for the notion might well have been the Vatican scandal known as the pornocracy, or the rule of harlots. This began with the ascension of Pope Sergius III in 904, a time conveniently close to the alleged time of Pope Joan. A weak and vacillating man, Sergius immediately fell under the spell of Theodora, the beautiful but viper-like wife of Rome's leading consul, Theophylact, Count of Tusculum, and a woman who used her sexual charms to keep Sergius and others in the Vatican compliant to her ambitions. Soon tiring of being so hands-on with Sergius, Theodora passed that duty to her 15-year-old daughter, Marozia. Despite her youth, Marozia immediately raised the stakes and, by engineering many political murders in the Vatican, made the Borgias look like amateurs. Her illegitimate son, by Sergius, would become Pope John XI, 931 to 935, and 2 of her grandsons, 2 of her great-grandsons, and 1 great-great-grandson each took their turn on the chair of St. Peter, a unique achievement in the history of the Vatican. Marozia bore the title of Senatrix and Patricia of Rome, the female equivalent of senator and patrician, bestowed on her by Pope John X, 914 to 928, yet another of her mother's lovers. She died in 937, after which the pornocracy pretty much fizzled out. The Protestant propagandists reasoned that if a woman had indeed been the real power behind the papal throne, they could, quote, rebrand this scandal in the form of an actual female pope. That just left them with the need to generate some suitable early references to the lady. Remember the strange appearance of Sweetheart and In the Family Way found in copies of Martin of Poland's work? It should also be said that some of the earliest known copies of his Chronicle of the Popes and Emperors, those kept safe from meddling hands, no mention of Pope Joan can be found. Also, many of the other references to Joan in other works appear as footnotes or margin notes that are in a hand quite unlike that of the main text. So if we accept Gibbon's suggestion that the 16th and 17th century Protestant propaganda machine simply resurrected the pornocracy in the form of Pope Joan and concocted backwashed forgeries into medieval manuscripts, then all makes sense. And the sidebar for this one is called On the Big Screen. The Vatican's distaste for the notion of a woman once having hoodwinked the cardinals into appointing her pope has not been made any better by the constant parade of books, plays, and films promoting that idea as fact. The most recent venture into celluloid was Pope Joan from 2009, a German film with Johanna Wokalek in the title role. which attracted disdain from the Vatican for billing itself as a, quote, true story. La Vigna, a Catholic newspaper, branded the film a vacuous hoax and an enterprise of little vision, but this did not stop it achieving box office success and placing it in the Italian top 10 movie list for 2009-2010, taking second position just behind Sex and the City 2. Thank you, and we'll see how this looks.